What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, we are looking at the very best game. That is the first game from the recent Chessables Masters finals featuring Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura. This game features a very complicated, very interesting line of the Italian opening. Magnus, just swindling the win from Hikaru in this game. I don't want to ruin anything else. Let's dive right in. All right, in the game, Magnus opens 1 e4, and we do have the Italian opening after e5, knight f3, knight to c6, and finally bishop c4, a very, very popular opening at the highest level these days. Now here, Hikaru, ever since the Candidates Tournament in 2024, he popularized this line where you go knight f6, pressuring the pawn on e4, the 2 knights defense, white goes d3 defending, and now the main move here for black is bishop c5, getting your dark squared bishop outside the pawn chain. You want to go bishop c5, d6, short castles, and so on, but Hikaru has popularized this line where you go h6 first. Now, what is the idea behind this move? Is very simple. You guard g5, stop bishop g5 ideas, and maybe you are flirting with the idea of an early g5 advance. All right, no problem. Magnus castles, short castles on the board, and now Hikaru, instead of going, say, d6 g5, that is kind of the old idea behind this move. Here, Hikaru plays the same move he played in the 2024 Candidates Tournament extensively. He plays the move bishop c5. All right, this already is very weird if you're not familiar with, modern edge opening theory. Black playing an early h6, then bishop c5. Now, technically, if white goes for an early c3 and b4, the computer says perhaps this line is a little bit less inaccurate, as the early h6 does not synergize well when white goes for a c3, b4 advance. But Hikaru has done a tremendous amount of preparation in this line. He knows it inside and out, and he seems to think black is going to be okay. All right, Magnus goes c3, the standard move, setting up both d4 and b4 advances. Black goes d6, again, getting the bishop outside the pawn chain, then going d6, a very solid dark squared strategy. Now, Magnus, knight d2, very typical move. Black castles, white goes h3, guarding g4. The idea being you want to go h3 before rook e1, stopping knight g4 ideas, pressuring f2, all so far very, very standard. And now here, Hikaru, his main choice is what do you want to do about the a-pawn and the bishop on c5. Now here, black can go a6 or a5, transposing to early a6 or a5 lines in the Italian opening. That is very fine, it's very standard. But instead here, Hikaru, bishop b6 is the move, a very interesting choice. Now, the idea behind this move, you are getting out of the way of a future b4 or d4 advance, but b6 is a little bit strange of a square. Normally, black goes a7. Now, b6 also playable. We'll have to see what happens here. All right, Magnus, rook e1. Black goes a5. Interesting. You normally don't go for the early bishop b6 with the early a5. Normally, you wait a little bit while longer to play these two moves together, but Hikaru, again, he has his reasons. And now here again, white's got a tremendous number of options, a lot of different ways to play for an advantage. For example, knight f1, bishop b3, and bishop b5 are perhaps the strongest moves. Instead, a4 chosen in the game, blocking the a file. All right, now black, bishop b6, challenging white's light squared bishop. This is one of black's most common ideas in the Italian opening. If black can go bishop e6 and then perhaps rook e8 and d5, breaking in the center, he's going to have something very, very close to full equality. Now here, Magnus, he's got a few different options. You can, for example, go bishop b5, ignoring the bishop and challenging the knight on c6. You can also trade on e6, or you can go b3 as played in the game. Now, Hans Niemann, Magnus Carlsen's favorite chess player of all time, has played quite a few games with this sort of early b3 advance in the Italian, supporting the bishop on c4. Of course, Hans Niemann being a huge Italian opening expert, so you never know. Perhaps Magnus hit Hans Niemann up on Twitter and got some lessons for this game right here. All right, now Hikaru, what is he going to do? The strongest move here is, of course, d5, breaking in the center, but instead rook to e8 played in the game. Now, this move is logical. You support the bishop on e6. If white trades, you trade back with the rook. You maintain the pawn structure and so on. But it turns out now with the rook on the e8 square, Magnus Carlsen, he knows this. You go bishop b5 here, pinning the knight on c6 to the rook on e8. Again, perhaps he got this from his good friend Hans Niemann. The point being now, with that knight pinned, d4 is actually quite dangerous. If white can go d4, then d5, then that pawn would fork the bishop and the knight. So Magnus Carlsen already getting Hikaru apparently out of his preparation a little bit. All right, black, Hikaru, he sees this. Bishop d7 is the move. A multi-purpose move. First of all, unpinning that knight. Second of all, if white goes d4, then d5, obviously that would not fork both the knight and the bishop. So overall, a solid play. Now, white, knight c4, jumping up with that knight, pressuring the bishop on the b6 square. Where is it going to go? All right, now Hikaru, he doesn't want to allow knight takes b6. For example, black wastes a move. I don't know, king to h8, any move you want. Then knight takes would be devastating from a strategic perspective. Of course, after c takes, then black's pawns on the queen side would be just completely shattered. You cannot allow that. So instead, back in this position right here, Hikaru goes bishop c5, a fine move. Of course, also a7, also a good square for the bishop. Now, Magnus here, I don't know how he does it. According to the engine, the strongest move here, I mean, if you like puzzles, pause the video, and this is not a tactical puzzle, but try to find the top engine line right here for Magnus. Now, Hans Niemann has played this move quite a bit in the Italian, especially against Magnus in their 2024 Speed Chess Championships one-on-one match. If you saw my videos of their games, you might know what I'm talking about. Here, Magnus, he plays the move bishop d2. It's sort of a weird waiting move. The computer is trying to argue white doesn't really have anything productive he can do. The best thing you can do is get the bishop off the back rank, connect the rooks a little bit sooner, and wait for black to play a move. And somehow Magnus finds it. It's really absurd how he does that. Now Hikaru, he plays a move that melted my brain. He just wasted a move going bishop b6, then white went knight c4, and he went bishop c5, and now he's going to go bishop a7. The bishop going c5, b6, c5, and now a7, and literally the c5, then a7 voluntarily. Why did it go to a7 in response to d2? I mean, I'm going to be honest, guys. Your guess is as good as mine. It's sort of a waiting move. Black also saying there's not a whole lot I can do right now. Perhaps Hikaru intending, say, knight e7, g6, trading bishops, and so on. But again, comment down below if you know why this was the move played in the game. I'm only rated 1800 ELO on chess.com. I'm trying to stream very soon my own game, so stay tuned for that. So, I try to study opening theory, but this move, bishop c5, then a7, puzzles me as an amateur here. All right, now Magnus, he decides it is time to initiate tactical complications. The computer says queen to e2 is likely strongest, but instead, bishop takes c6 chosen in the game, trading off his precious Italian-style bishop for the knight. Now, you normally don't want to do that unless you have a very good reason, but of course, here the idea, that knight on c6, it defends the pawn on the a5 square. So, if you trade it off, bishop takes c6 and black takes back, bishop takes c6, then that pawn on the a5 square is hanging, white jumps in and takes it, knight takes a5, and suddenly white is temporarily up a pawn. Of course, not is all as it seems. Here Hikaru, he spots the tactical idea. Again, pause the video if you want to see a really cool puzzle or solve one yourself. And here the idea, bishop takes f2. Of course, you give up the bishop, but open up the attack on the knight on a5. So both sides lose a pawn, white on f2, black on a5. Let's see what happens from here. The king takes, then the rook takes, and now we have the move b4, driving back the rook. All right, rook to a8, and then b5, driving back the bishop, bishop d7, and now c4. All right, Magnus getting a very impressive light square pawn brigade in the queen side in the center of the board here. Gotham Chess would be impressed by this light squared strategy, trading off your light squared bishop and then having only a dark squared bishop left. I mean, it seems like whenever I watch Gotham Chess's channel, he's always just foaming at the mouth when someone plays a perhaps a Karo Khan style light square strategy like this. All right, now Hikaru, c6 is the move, moving the pawn down one square, and putting pressure on b5. Magnus, king g1, logical. The king was quite exposed on f2, so you trade it back away from the f2 square. Now here, black, the strongest move according to the engine is knight h5, a very thematic idea. The point being, the knight eyes the g3 and the f4 dark squares, and the queen has access to f6. That would be a very good attacking setup. Black may even be able to go, say, g5, king h8, rook g8, and so on later in the game. Whenever black still has those pawns on d6 and e5, this sort of attacking idea on the king side can work very, very well. Now, instead of that, in the game, bishop e6 was chosen. Now, what is the idea behind this move? You're just improving the bishop, nothing too fancy. And here, white finds, again, a very strong move, a5, gaining even more space on the queen side. And of course, with the bishop on d2, the pawn is defended. Was this the idea of bishop d2 played so long ago? I'm not sure. Comment down below if you think it was. All right, now Hikaru, knight d7 is the move. He retreats his knight. It is sort of the same idea as knight h5. Now, this opens up queen f6 ideas where Hikaru could play for some sort of active play on the king's side. All right, now Magnus, king to h1 is the move, sliding over with the king. Black takes on b5, c takes b5. He did miss the very strong idea of f5. That is very often the idea behind knight d7 in these Italian structures, but instead, c takes b5, c takes, and then knight c5. So overall, c5 is quite a good square for the knight. It does pressure d3 and so on. And here Magnus says the best way to defend it is not to move the bishop, is to go rook to a3, the rook lift. The rook now supports the pawn on d3. Of course, with the rook on a3, the queen has access to the a1 square. That could be important later in the game if things get heated on the a file. All right, now Hikaru, bishop d7 is the move. He retreats the bishop and pressures the pawn on b5. Now Magnus, queen b1, defends the pawn on b5 that was being attacked by the bishop. Very logical. And here Hikaru, knight to e6. So completing a very cool knight journey. Black going knight d7, c5, e6, and now on e6, the knight has access to both d4 and f4 squares. So kind of a long process, but overall, the knight does seem to be better placed on e6 over f6. Of course, the pawn on e4 is just rock solid. It's not doing a whole lot on f6. All right, now here, Magnus, he decides it's time to get my alpha 0 pass pawn on the a file. a6 is the move. Black takes and white takes back. Now black, knight c5, pressuring the pawn on a6, as well as putting a little bit of pressure on that pawn on the d3 square. Magnus says, all right, a7 is the move. You advance the pawn up one square. Black goes queen to c7, pressuring that pawn. And now we do see one of those benefits of the move rook a3 played so much earlier in this game. Here, Magnus, queen to a1 is the move, sliding over with the queen. The rook and the queen now both support that pawn on the a7 square, so very solid play by Magnus. And of course, you got to go to the a1 square if you go to, say, a2. Then bishop e6 is a very nasty idea, putting pressure on the queen immediately. Instead, queen to a1 played in the game. And now Hikaru, I mean, he's played not flawlessly, but pretty darn close for almost the entire game. The only inaccurate move I could find was 11 rook to e8, which allowed white to go bishop b5. But now Hikaru makes a little bit of a mistake here. He goes for the move bishop b5. Now, this move, it's logical. You're putting pressure on a very weak pawn on the d3 square. However, here, Magnus, he ignores the threat on the pawn and he just goes bishop b3. Now, what is the idea here? You're putting some pressure on the knight. You're putting some indirect, not pressure, you're indirectly defending the pawn on a7. That could be important later in the game, but of course, you're giving up the pawn on d3. And Hikaru, he tries to call Magnus Carlsen's bluff. He takes on d3, knight takes d3, but it turns out Magnus was not bluffing. He goes rook to b1, sliding the rook over, and now look at all of this pressure Magnus has on the queen side. The bishop, the queen, the rook, and the rook all slicing down on these diagonals and files right where the action is. All right, now the best move for black to defend everything, at least for now, is going to be queen d7. You slide over the queen, defend the bishop on b5, and for now, everything is kind of doing okay. Instead, in the game, bishop c4 was chosen, and this move is a critical mistake. Here, Magnus, he just goes knight d2, dropping back his knight. Of course, on f3, his own knight wasn't really doing a whole lot. Black's likely never going to go d5, at least not in the near future. Therefore, e5 was more than supported, so he drops back to d2 to pressure c4. But just as I say that, with the knight on f3, the pawns on e6 and e5 and d6 make a lot of sense. So with the knight here, this pawn structure makes perfect sense, but once you go knight d2, white relinquishes the pressure on the e5 pawn, and here Hikaru says it is time to break in the center. He goes d5, white takes, and then Hikaru, F5 is the move. All right, this is a super controversial decision. The computer says, no way, Jose. Instead, the move is bishop takes d5. Of course, after rook takes d3, white has a huge initiative nonetheless. Instead, in the game, F5 was chosen, and this is where things get really, really heated. Obviously, black having very powerful, I guess they're called hanging pawns. I mean, hanging pawns are more common after 1d4 openings on the C and D files, but I guess technically this would be hanging pawns as well. All right, now Magnus, queen c3, jumping up with the queen, pressuring the bishop and the knight on the d3 square. Now black goes e4, gaining more space and further bolstering his knight on d3. So far, things look pretty good for Hikaru, but of course, he's losing his bishop on c4. Queen takes c4 is the move, and there was no really good way to avoid that. I mean, white was going to win the bishop on c4 or that knight on d3 one way or another, so there just wasn't a whole lot that black could do there. All right, now here, Magnus Carlsen, he plays the move, Hikaru, queen to g3, dropping in with the queen. It's very active there. White drops back, knight f1, defending the bishop and also defending in general these dark squares around the king side. Now Hikaru, knight f2 is the move, jumping in with his knight. He's trying to make something happen, and this is a solid move. Here, of course, if the bishop takes on f2, then the rook on a3 will be hanging. However, Magnus decides it is time to make that trade. If you don't do it, if you go king g1, then black's going to have a lot of nasty ideas, including knight takes h3. And of course, the pawn on the g2 square will be pinned to the king. Instead, Magnus says, I'm up so much material. Let's just simplify. So here, bishop takes f2 is the move. Of course, that leaves the rook on the a3 square undefended. The queen takes on a3, queen takes a3, and then white plays the key move d6, advancing the pawn, opening up the attack on the king on the g8 square. All right, now black, king to h7 is the move. White goes queen d5, advancing with the queen. Of course, d7 was a little bit stronger immediately, but queen d5 also just fine. Magnus is essentially up an exchange here. He's got the extra, not exchange, sorry. He's up the two minor pieces versus the rook, and his pawns on d6 and a7 are very, very strong. That gives him just a colossal advantage here. And in the game, black plays one more move, f4, again advancing his hanging pawns. And here Magnus, he simply goes queen to f5, hitting the king and also the pawn on the f4 square. Black is going to be losing that pawn after, say, king g8, queen takes f4. White still has d6 defended. He's up the two minor pieces, plus up versus the rook, plus up a pawn, plus his pawns on d6 and a7 are very, very strong. Keep in mind, the bishop on the f2 square still supports that pawn on a7. So for that reason here, Magnus Carlsen, he simply obliterated Hikaru, and Hikaru is forced to resign on the spot. Wow, what a game between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura in game number 1 of their 2025 Chessables Masters Finals one-on-one match. I mean, Magnus taking a few key ideas out of Hans Niemann's playbook in the Italian opening from this games. Maybe he got some private lessons. You never know. I mean, these guys, you never know what happens behind the scenes. So comment down below if you think that actually happened. But I got to say, Magnus actually taking some moves out of Hans Niemann's book in this game, which is very, very cool to see. So anyways, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. And by the way, guys, I am dropping all of my socials in the description below. If you've been following for a long time, thank you so much for following my videos and whatnot. I am about to start streaming. I am trying to make this a full-time gig for myself. Right now, it's sort of a side hustle based on the income I'm generating from, you know, the YouTube and whatnot, but I'm really interested in seeing if I can make this a full-time thing by providing a lot more content for you guys. So check out all my socials below. If you want to support me, feel free to join this channel as a membership. I'm also setting up a Patreon. I'm doing one-on-one coaching right now. So full disclaimer, I'm only rated about 1800 on chess.com. You can see in my profile, Dr. Mike Chess 1. That's the profile, and I'm about 2,000 on Lead Chess. I'm keeping that account private for now, and I am going to start streaming more on chess.com and pumping up the rating and whatnot. I haven't played as much recently, so we're going to see if I can do that. So if you want to support me, feel free to, you know, purchase a channel membership, subscribe on Patreon if you want to support me that way. Follow me on Twitch, follow me on any of the other socials. If you want to join the coaching program, feel free to do that. And also on the Patreon, what I'm trying to do is have a tier where I'll play against you know, anyone in that tier at least once a week, likely on weekends, likely on a Saturday or a Sunday. So if you want to play against me personally, you can either do the coaching option. I'm happy to play against you, or you can join the second tier on my Patreon, and I will be happy to play against, you know, whoever's on that tier. If it gets too big and I have a hard time playing against you guys, we'll work something else out. But yeah, that is an option as well. So I hope you guys enjoy the increased content. I am going to also try to respond to comments on the YouTube channel soon. So, you know, hope you guys enjoy all of this, and, you know, feel free to email me with suggestions, whatever it is you guys think that I should be doing to kind of give you guys a better experience. So that's all for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. As always, smash that like button if you can. Subscribe to the channel. And if you want to see more Magnus versus Hikaru action, check out this video right here, where I cover yet another one of their latest and greatest games. And I'll see you in the next video.